Well, hello everybody. It's just gone 9 o'clock in Washington. It's just gone 2 o'clock here in London. Welcome to this final Parliamentary Network session before Christmas. We very much hope that this finds you well, wherever you're joining in from. And we thought we would wrap up 2021 with a quick discussion on one of the big topics that is going to really require lots of our work, lots of our thinking over the course of 2022. It is without doubt one of the hardest problems that we as parliamentarians will need to confront next year as we shift from the pandemic and towards the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement. We think that tax policy is something that here in the Parliamentary Network we should talk about an awful lot more. And I'm absolutely delighted that today that we'll be joined by Chiara Bronchi from the World Bank at a tax group. It's a real pleasure for me to welcome Honourable Steve Aziki, our new Vice Chair, who will be joining us from Nigeria to give us a perspective from the front line in one of our parliaments. So we've framed today's session around a trilemma, which is that first, as we say a lot in the Parliamentary Network, this crisis is not over. We have been saying this for most of the course of this year, and the Omicron variant is really proof, I think, of much of the force of our argument. We have still got an awful long way to go before we jab the world and ensure that there is proper vaccination systems in place for all of the world's citizens. And that is without doubt going to have an impact, not just on lives, but on livelihoods too. Second, countries around the world are now fast running out of fiscal space to act. We've had the most extraordinary response, both from central banks and from governments over the course of this crisis. But the blunt reality is we now have levels of debt, public debt, as well as corporate debt around the world, which are extremely high. And as some Western countries begin to exit from their monetary policy stimulus, we do now risk a riptide of money moving out of emerging economies and developing countries back into richer countries, and that is going to create additional pressure too. Third, as we saw writ large at COP26 in Glasgow, we have all still got an awful long way to go before we mobilise the climate finance that we need to actually deliver on the goals that have been agreed by the international community to save our planet and cut carbon. There was a very significant shortfall in the $100 billion promised for climate finance, and it's not yet clear from the Glasgow agreements how those shortfalls are going to be fixed in the years ahead. So as parliamentarians, we now have to figure out, okay, how do we carry on investing and exiting from the crisis? How do we cope with higher levels of debt? And third, how do we begin to mobilize the climate finance that we need for the future? Now, as if all of that was not complicated enough, rising levels of inflation, especially in food prices and commodities, mean that the political space to act is also in short supply. Lots of countries around the world have now got rising prices, which mean a squeeze on living standards. And that isn't a great environment for parties to be proposing tax rises. And I suppose the final piece of complexity we wanted to put on the table is that we know from work that our colleagues in the IMF have done that carbon pricing is going to be one of the most important tools in the armory to tackle climate change. But obviously, carbon pricing has pretty significant impact on gas prices, petrol prices, domestic heat prices, as well as industrial prices too. So there is an awful lot to try and slalom through, and 2022 is going to be, I think, one of the first years when all of those issues are going to kind of come together in one big political and economic struggle. Now, as we used to say 10 years ago, we kind of know what to do. We just don't know how to get re-elected once we've done it. So as parliamentarians and people in the Parliamentary Network, Chiara, we are really grateful to you for coming along to provide a bit of some expert advice. So we're going to hear from you first, and then we're going to hear from my friend and our Vice Chair, Steve. And then I'm going to have some follow-up questions, and we're going to try and wrap it up in about 40 minutes' time. So, Chiara, floor's yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Liam. It's really an honor and a privilege to be here today to present some of the thinking of the World Bank. It's a broad agenda. It's very challenging, as Liam has said. So I doubt that I will do justice to everything, but I try to explain the way we think. If I manage to share my screen now, I hope I succeed. Share, and I hope you can see my presentation here. So for those who do not know me, I am a practice manager in the macroeconomics, trade and investment group and of the World Bank. And we are indeed working on these issues and thinking around particularly fiscal policy, both on the tax and the quality of spending side as well. So today, I know we don't have a lot of time, and Liam has been very strict with the time, but I want to give you a little bit of what the observations, the data that we see, and then some policy directions. Then I also have some additional discussions points, but I leave them for later when it's a suitable time. So first of all, I think it's important to understand, really what we are talking about here. And the COVID-19 has hit really hard in terms of growth, and certainly also reversed the positive trend of extreme poverty reduction. I'm going to share this presentation, but certainly as you can see, the lines speak for themselves. This is really a problematic, big challenge, and certainly for the World Bank and our twin goal of shared prosperity and eradicating extreme poverty. The trends now, we're losing some of the gains from the past, basically. And now fiscal stimulus and growth contractions resulted in increased fiscal deficits, as Liam has said, and certainly also rising debt. And the impact of COVID-19 is definitely not uniform, and the emerging economies and developing countries, as well as low-income countries, have been hit harder. And for sure, the recovery will be slower. And this definitely results in a sharp and persistent rise in debt to GDP ratios. And that's what has triggered also the uniformed approach on debt. The push also from the bank on debt transparency and accountability, and obviously all our monitoring on debt sustainability. The third part is, okay, has the COVID-19 stimulus been green or brown? And my team in particular last year in 2020 has spent time researching and also analyzing. And I think that, and actually this paper by Miria Pigato, Ryan Rafati, and Curle, 2021, actually indicate that the crisis response, which was necessary, absolutely important and timely, but the stimulus was green, where countries had already started reforms to transition from carbon to renewable energy. But for those economies that were behind in this type of shifts, the recovery was what we call a brown or light brown. And I think why the COVID-19 containment measures resulted in temporary decrease, partly also due to the, decrease in CO2 emissions, also partly due to the slowdown of the economic activity. What we see now is that as the economy is recovering, and in some cases is recovering, especially in advanced economies, recovering fast, we also see that there is an acceleration of carbon CO2 emissions that are basically offsetting the gains that we had during the lockdown phase, basically. So it's catching up again. And so this COVID-19 impact also on the transition to a low carbon economy. So what we're saying is we see an increasing extreme poverty. We see a reduced space, fiscal space. We also see that the impact on the transition to a low carbon economy, which was getting on a positive trend, is mixed here, because we see that countries that had already, as I was saying, started this renewable energy path have accelerated it. But we also see that some of the gains have also been offset by other countries, and in particular emerging economies that did need to put the country back onto the recovery phase, where, however, have increased their coal capacity in this phase. It's also interesting because our research indicates that where companies, so now even at the micro level, companies were financially constrained, we saw that there is an associated effect of less of an incentive to invest in renewable energy or in transitioning into pro-green production. And equally clearly, lower oil prices also have a demand side factor, which results in a lower incentives to invest in environmental, technology or transitioning. So overall, the COVID-19 has brought different impacts. And let me also tell you that what we know from the data, and I'm sure you're familiar with this, but the cost of the greenhouse gas emissions, has dwarfed actually those of COVID-19 in terms of also of overall costs. The problem is that this has accumulated over time. It's not been a sharp shock as we've seen with the COVID-19. It's much more difficult to gauge and to have a rapid response, a policy response. But we see that actually COVID-19 has caused at least 3 million deaths in 133 countries in 2020 alone. Now, policies, well, clearly the challenges are complicated and the answers are equally complicated, and we certainly do not have the recipe that fits all. It definitely depends by country, but there are certain criteria that we think are valid a bit universally across the globe. And perhaps it's nothing new under the sun, but I think it's worth reminding us what the principles are that we continue to believe are also through our research and analytical evidence remain important dimensions and critical dimensions to consider. And certainly one is the efficiency of public spending, but also equally improve efficiency of taxation and also try to shift to a tax that it's often very burdensome for income, and I'll get to that point later, and try to shift to a tax burden that is less distortive, especially from an economic development perspective. So we normally continue to use 5 principles, policy principles, and so the need to distinguish between temporary and permanent measures. Always try to align short-term measures that are necessary, absolutely, but try to maintain the course, the vision over the long-term development objectives so that the short-term measures are not slowing down or actually reversing the gain or the objectives that require much longer time to be achieved. I spoke about efficiency, and also the efficiency comes with do more with less, but also minimize the distortion, and especially on the production factors. And clearly, this fair distribution remains important. In a nutshell, I think these are the underlying principles that we are also supporting under the green, resilient, and inclusive growth approach that the bank has endorsed earlier this year, the board of the World Bank. So I just want to give you a few ideas. So I only have a few more slides, about 4 or 5. But what we mean by temporary and permanent. So we have seen during the containment phase of the COVID-19 crisis, so immediately as the crisis burst out, that countries have tried to respond. Fiscal policy, Ministry of Finance have tried to help businesses and also citizens. And so we've been reduced rates, tax rates, suspension of certain withholding taxing, allowing to defer filing payments. But this it's important to also deferral of some of the capital investment projects, increased cash transfers. So these were all very important to contain the crisis, and for sure we're giving some oxygen to businesses, but it's important to underline the temporary phase, and so they have to be able to be waived out or phased out pretty quickly. So it's important to avoid introducing measures that are very difficult then to reverse. Permanent measures that could also help in the phase, it was to certainly, actually rather than measures, that was a moment, and some countries have used that also to assess whether we're using all the tax instruments. A lot of countries are still under taxing property, real estate. There's very little tax on wealth in general, so on capital gains, inheritance taxes, etc. Also consideration for tax expenditures. So there was some, and we see countries that have started to assess their tax expenditure, meaning subsidies or tax breaks, or so that they narrow the base, and started to consider in the preparation for the recovery how to expand the tax base without increasing statutory tax rates. And then, of course, it goes without saying that it was important. It's always important to keep an eye on the debt, and so the fiscal deficit, and so the importance of the transparent management of the debt and of the objectives of the use of the borrowing are extremely important. So also, I mentioned aligning short-term measures with long-term objectives, and let me give you some positive, what could be well aligned. So I talked about assessment of subsidies, certainly removing fossil fuel subsidies, and also inefficient VAT exemptions as an example. And every country, as I said, may have different measures that they want to consider, would work in the favor of aligning a short-term, what seems a short-term measure, to the long-term objective of sustainable, inclusive development growth. And also, it's important to combine increase of targeted cash transfers, and that's for the vulnerable, and also transitions measure to, again, the most vulnerable, also in a transition, and especially when we are removing certain subsidies that hit particular sectors, and this would be the energy sector. It would be important also to use the gains from the revenues addressing the vulnerabilities of those that are working in those sectors and may be particularly hit. These are just examples. It's not exhaustive by all means. Efficiency is many things, but on the revenue side, there are many things that happen. Actually, some of the low-income or emerging economies have realized that they had missed an opportunity by modernizing, by slowing down the modernization and the digitalization of their tax administrations. So we have seen an acceleration and a lot of requests to accelerate the digitalization of the basically revenue collection, automatization as well. But also it's important to improve tax compliance, and that's also in terms of transparency, communication, and ensure that there is tax compliance, voluntary tax compliance. And again, it's important, we have been recommending, and it's pretty much in line also with other sister organizations, including the IMF, to prioritize broadening the tax base over raising tax rates, especially in the recovery phase. But these measures on revenues is not enough. They also need to be accompanied by the expenditure side. And I won't now go into the technical details, but the efficiency also of the spending and the sequencing of prioritization are extremely important from the moment of the budget all the way through the allocation and of the execution of the budget, and also clarity on the sectors that can lead to more investment areas that can lead to more growth and also support the vulnerables. as I said, it's also important to minimize distortions on growth to protect recovery. And again, it's an issue of timing, prioritization, and it's not, it's also the sequencing and also how to communicate effectively. And also this requires analytical work. So it's important also to invest in data in order to have policy or evidence-based policy and to be able to better sequence these decisions, policy decisions. Clearly, a fair distribution of the burden of these measures, it's important. And we see as a priority, on one hand, to support those who are most in need. And that can be done also through a reassessment of, for example, a general VAT. Is it regressive or is it progressive? But while we're broadening the tax base, it might be also useful to consider how to use the resources that are freed up for more revenues. And on the other hand, we've been supporting, and also we made a big commitment in the IDA 20 discussions, the importance of redistribution and fairness of the systems on the tax side, but also on the spending side. So it's, on one hand, I'm saying protect the vulnerable, but also try to tax more the wealthiest. And also that's not enough. There is a need to assess the fairness of a fiscal system in general. So it's not just revenues, tax systems that are more equitable, but also the spending has to be maintain the same equity. Otherwise, the effects would be offset. So I stop here for now. I know we want to discuss also more in detail the inflationary impacts, but I hand over to you, Liam, and happy to discuss the other issues as you see fit.
Well, that is a
Thank you.
That's a fantastic presentation. Thank you so much for taking us through all of that. And thank you very much indeed for offering to share those slides, because there's so much good material in there. I know that will be of real interest to our Parliamentary Network members around the world. Now, we're going to get a response now from our Vice Chair. So Honourable Steve Aziki, Professor Honourable Steve Aziki. It's a real privilege for me to introduce you to everybody. Let me hand the floor to you, and then let's give ourselves sort of 10 or 15 minutes for discussion at the end. There's a couple of questions that I think we can get stuck into, but over to you, Steve.
Okay, Liam, thank you very much. Good evening, my colleagues from around the world. I am honored and very happy to be given the opportunity to participate in this conversation. My name is Honorable Steve Aziki. I'm from Nigeria, Member of Parliament. In Nigeria, we call it the House of Representatives. I've looked at issues that are topical today, and I have a very comprehensive paper, but I think that we won't have time to be in the classroom. So maybe I will just highlight what I think would be relevant. You know, for instance, the issues and the problems of the coronavirus pandemic is something of concern to the whole world. Also, we have to look at the reactions of developed countries and the relationship with developing countries. For instance, the news of the Omicron and the way developed nations responded to it, and how we in the developed countries, especially in Africa, feel about it. Then we have to look at the climate change and what effect has this got to do with the rising inflation, with the poverty and the difficulties we're having here in Africa, for example. And I also looked at the multinational who are operating different standards in different countries. In Nigeria, for example, the gas flaring is an issue. 97% 75% of gases are flared in Nigeria. And in the developed country, it's a different ball game. I also looked at inflation. Today, inflation is unbelievably high in around the world, but especially in Africa. And I also looked at debt issues. And I believe that there should be a review of how these debts are being given to Africa. And that is in good faith. And also to look at sanctions against leaders and how these debts are used is also very, very important, because debts must be tied to projects, to programs, and so on. And the lenders must monitor implementation. For example, you look at the debt profile of Nigeria, it's unbelievable. 87.239 billion US dollars. Nigeria is owing today. So we are using about 97% of government revenue to service debt. How can a country get out of that? So we have to look at that. And we have to look at the advance of China into Africa. And that should influence the World Bank and the IMF to review their loan conditions and how these loans are given. So then in Nigeria, I looked at subsidy removal. It has been a pain in the neck for Nigeria and even the government over the years. We tried in 2016 to remove subsidy, but it was impossible. And now we are saying we are going to remove it in the first quarter of 2022. I don't know how that will be feasible. That is going to, if not properly checked and well articulated, it will cause catastrophe in the country. Now, also, we look at taxation. How are we going to still talk about taxation? In the world, in developed countries, it's very easy. In Africa, especially my country, Nigeria, we don't even have strong institutions that can even implement or enforce taxation. So it's an issue that we must look at it carefully. So as national economies across the world face challenges of high debts, soaring inflation, and the effects of climate change, the question we ask ourselves, can tax help in alleviating some of these problems? Is taxation going to play some important roles in solving these challenges? We must look at that. Then I believe that inflation today is basically disruption of supply chains, caused by the coronavirus pandemic. So we must critically look at how we can strengthen supply chains around the world, because with the issues of with the pandemic, the traditional supply routes have been blocked, and we are having serious problem. Commodities are not getting to destinations. I believe that there should be tax incentives, especially in the sectors that are very, very critical and necessary for development. And also we must look at the cost of subsidies to government. And if we must, then we must look at taxing industries that contribute to rising climate change. So also, it is important that for Nigeria, the discussion here today is if we should remove subsidy for premium motor spirit, the PMS as we call it in Nigeria. It's a very critical, serious discussion, because government needs money. If subsidy is removed, then we will have some money for critical infrastructure. But how do you remove subsidy when you've not taken care of some basic challenges of the people? So I know that if we don't look at it here in Nigeria critically, it's going to cause a lot of crisis that it will be difficult to manage, because with inflation, with what is happening right now, the people are tired and they are the bricks of revolting. So if you are going to remove subsidy, we have to critically look at what will be provided as an alternative, or how this subsidy if we are to remove it gradually or we are to let it be for now. But if government must function properly, one of the things was that subsidy in Nigeria has been a channel for corruption, for abuse of power, and so on and so forth. So to remove the subsidy, yes, but we must now look at how best we will do it so that the people will be less affected. Also, taxes can be used as a tool for dealing with rising national debts, especially in our developing countries. It may also interest to note that in Nigeria and most African countries, it is difficult to tax everybody because of statistics, because of information, because of technology. So the institutions are too weak to even perform their usual functions. So we can only use taxation to target industries, and I believe those industries that affect climate change will be the ones that will be easily targeted and give tax relief to those economies that are servicing national interests and the people. So a combination of tax hikes and incentives can help tackle the challenges of rising inflation and soaring debts in Nigeria and in general, the developing world. So my contribution here will be, one is, let us, given this opportunity and speaking from the political angle, we should look at reactions to information or news coming out of coronavirus, new discoveries. Are we going to speak to science? Are we going to allow science to speak for us? Then we should look at how climate change is affecting our development and progress, especially our economies. And this is general. Climate change is real. Then also, if we are to make progress, then the world must come together in terms of how to provide relief, continue for now. Yes, there has been debt suspension for about 19 months, but I think the coronavirus, the end is not in sight. So we should stay on that route. We should continue to suspend debt so that our nations can use, the money for debt servicing to improve on vaccination, improve on healthcare, and provide other necessary amenities. Like I said, in Nigeria, the government spends 97% of government revenue on debt servicing. Imagine if the lenders have not suspended debt servicing for these past 19 months, what would have happened? How are we going to buy vaccine? And also, Africa should be encouraged to produce vaccines at home. And this is what the president of South Africa said, that it's not about monopoly, it's not about monopoly. We should allow the developing nations. India and South Africa has the capacity. And with South African support and with the scientists we have in Nigeria, Africa should be given opportunity to produce these vaccines in Africa. So I think there will be other contributors. If there is need, I'll come back again. But my paper encompasses all of these that I have said, and I may send it to the Secretariat if there is need for that. Thank you.
Steve, absolutely fantastic. And thank you so much for just bringing the discussion down into the realm of practical politics and practical economics. And I think in particular that nexus of issues that you described, the relationship between very high levels of inflation, the challenge of rationalizing subsidies in that context, at a time when there is a lack of tax institutions and alternatives, and very high debt levels that require servicing. I mean, that is just a very difficult set of problems, and it's very, very hard to see how we're going to solve those problems without creating some more fiscal space through debt suspension. So your paper would be really welcome. We should absolutely be circulating that through the network and on the network's website as well. So we've got about 10 minutes for questions, which I'm going to put on everyone's behalf, you'll be pleased to hear. So there's a couple of things that really jump out. And I think the first question is really your reflections on the fact that this crisis has not been equal. So you presented, Jerry, you presented some really powerful statistics about the number of deaths, but also the number of people plunged into poverty. Last week, the World Inequality Forum published some pretty arresting statistics about how those who are wealthy have got a lot wealthier. So the fact that we have put in this massive monetary policy stimulus, that's obviously been pretty good news for asset owners, for capital owners, and for those who take their returns from capital income or capital gains. So some have done very well, actually, over the last year and a half. I think the Financial Times labelled it as the biggest ever increase in the billionaire register in history. That's why I was so interested to see you flagging wealth taxes, both in terms of property and capital gains, as basically the line that you had against revenues there in your slide. Could you just say a little bit more about the bank's view on wealth taxes? Sometimes we shorthand this to wealth taxes when actually what we really mean is bigger taxes on the wealthy. But it would be great to get your perspective on that. And Steve, I'd love to hear from you as well what the politics of wealth taxes might look like in Nigeria. But Shara, do you want to start off?
Sure, and thank you. And first of all, let me say that the issues that Honorable Azaiki has raised are obviously very important. My team has been monitoring the use of resources that were saved by the debt suspension initiative. And we were actually reassured that all the countries that have used the initiative or availed themselves have really used the resources to support the most vulnerable and to respond to the health as well as the economic crisis. Now, coming to then the next, they're still going to face serious challenges in terms of fiscal sustainability and also the need to create fiscal space for investment. And as also Honorable Azaiki was saying. So the bank is, first of all, as I said, we have adopted this vision of a green, resilient, and inclusive growth. And in that approach, there is also a vision for revenues and domestic resource mobilization. And I'll come to your point. So clearly, a part of this approach that has also been recently approved and is available on the website of the World Bank to our board is a vision of how raise domestic resource mobilization also in a fair way. So not just more, but also better. And definitely we have an emphasis on taxation of the wealthy. I think you said it very well, Liam. It's not so much wealth taxes. Yes, some countries have experimented or are using wealth taxes, meaning taxation of net wealth, assuming that you can calculate the net wealth. But that's quite, it's good, it's great, but it's quite complex to address the assessment of net wealth. We want to promote more the idea of taxation of wealth more broadly. And it maybe is less direct, but we believe it's another form of redistribute or assessing or making the tax system more progressive or more equitable, fair, let's say that. So two fronts. One is we're working on it. So we are committed to promote this agenda. And we are actually working on ourselves. So we are not come out analytically yet, but we certainly see opportunities, as I was saying earlier, to use real estate taxes better. A lot of countries are underutilizing that tax instrument. A lot of countries don't have health taxes. Of course, it's a social decision. Sorry, not health, inheritance taxes. Inheritance taxes. We're also looking at a better balance between taxation of labor and capital, because most of the capital which is owned by the wealthy is often much less taxed than labor. So the relative production factors are, labor is always more expensive, and it does have implications also in terms of equity. Then for IDA and low income countries, we have made a big commitment to our donors, basically the IDA members, to look at helping low income countries to increase tax GDP ratios. We have as a target 15%, but also to assess the fairness of the system. In some countries, there's not enough data or not as well-developed data sets as you can find in advanced economies. And that's why we're also developing an assessment together also with our poverty colleagues, a simplified approach to actually be able to respond also to and help IDA countries. Sorry, IDA is the International Development Agency that is supporting low-income countries. To report also on the progress in the terms of more revenues, but also fairer collection. Thank you.
Perfect. Steve, what's your perspective on trying to restore some equity between those who have done well over the last year and a half and everybody else? What's the politics and the economics of that in Nigeria? Oh, sorry, you're just on mute, Steve. There we
go. I would say that our economies are very fragile now, very, very fragile. We are doing very, very badly in terms of foreign reserve and the loan debt and now coronavirus. So right now, it is very, very difficult to really find a balance or even be able to separate the poor and the rich. I don't know whether your question is about nations or about the people, but if it's about Nigeria, we have 1% that are rich. The rest are because the middle class, I don't know whether it's because of inflation, even the middle class is vanishing. And so what we have now is the poor and the rich. So yes, with the coronavirus, we all leveled, kind of leveled. For instance, our health facilities are very bad. And even the rich that used to travel easily to Europe and America because of the coronavirus, we are all at home. Managing our poor health facilities, which is an eye-opener. The challenge now that we both know now that we have to face. Also, in terms of moving around, we all enter the same airline, even though the rich may fly first class and the poor may fly economy, but it's the same aircraft. And with the issues and problems of coronavirus, we are all at the same level. So, but yes, we still have those who are doing business, government business in the oil industry. And also we have some companies that are working. But the issue now is that are these companies paying appropriate taxes? I don't think so. The Nigerians, every qualified adult paying the taxes that he is supposed to pay? I do not think so. And have we been able to handle corruption? I do not think so. I do not think so as so many. So honestly, I believe that comparing what it is today, we can still look at taxing some companies, especially those companies that are in the oil industry. Only recently, in the Niger Delta part of Nigeria, the southern part of Nigeria, there was an oil spill. It took the company 30 days to contain the oil spill. And the cost to the environment, the cost to life and property is inestimable. So if we must look at environmental justice, if we must worry about climate change, if we must worry about the next generation, then this company, this particular company, should be brought to book. It should be sanctioned. It should be given, it should be made an example of how decency should be and how people should operate in an environment. So yes, we can tax some of these companies heavily because they are making money and because they don't care about the environment. So we can look at those companies and tax them. And Madam Clara of the World Bank, I also want to say that we should worry about corruption, and we should worry about the interest rates of your loans. We should also, like you rightly said, you are monitoring implementation. That is very good. But I can tell you for free that the monies borrowed by most of these African countries are not used for the purpose for which they are borrowed. So I think that, if I'm deviating, I'm sorry, but I think that we cannot be borrowing and nothing is coming out of this money borrowed. So what will future generations do? Look at our debt profile. Our debt profile is 35 trillion naira, 35 trillion naira. Yeah? Even 10 generations can't pay that back, you know. So is there a way that leaders, not the nation, can be sanctioned if they leave office, if and when they leave office, so that they know that they are accountable to those loans, they are indebted to future generations? So I don't know if I've answered the question, but these are things that are working in my head and I needed to say it. Thank you.
Yeah, no, you definitely have answered the question. And I think this may be something we need to get into early next year, but there are now some important initiatives globally, such as the new Interparliamentary Alliance on Kleptocracy that was launched with the help of folks like Transparency International last week. That actually may be something that we as a parliamentary network consider affiliating to, because a lot of its work, I think, is going to tackle or try to tackle a number of the issues there that Steve raised. So I'm running out of time now, but there is just one question I wouldn't mind just putting in, if you can indulge me, which is about the role of carbon taxes and how well we understand the relationship between carbon taxes and inflation. So Steve talked about some of the challenges of high inflation. I don't think we've yet got good roadmaps for how carbon taxes are implemented. This is something that Larry Fink flagged from BlackRock a week or two ago. Chara, has the bank actually begun to look at the relationship between carbon taxes and inflation?
So I wouldn't say we're looking at it from an inflationary perspective, but definitely we are concerned that you know, what is the impact of introducing carbon taxes on the economy? But I need to start perhaps from the theory first. And now the traditional theory normally is that suggests that raising taxes is deflationary, actually, because raising consumption taxes cuts households' disposable income And so reducing the purchasing power and hence has a negative impact on inflation. And raising corporate and labor taxes have similar deflationary effects. And although it works through different channels. So to the extent that carbon taxes, like all taxes, reduce economic output, traditionally theories would suggest they are deflationary in the medium term. Now, of course, in the short term, carbon taxes may be inflationary, yes, and particularly in countries that have limited access to green technologies. That's what we have found. And I will share some of the research because we have done quite a lot of assessment of tax policy mix. In other words, we would not recommend to levy carbon taxes alone, but also explain how the resources from carbon taxes are going to be spent to compensate those who may lose. And that's something that I hinted before. And so our recent research shows that while labor taxes directly affect aggregate demand, environmental taxes may affect relative prices and therefore inflation. And let's call it environmental taxes are found to be not so impactful in terms of output growth, but certainly there is a need to, there is an incentive to substitute. So what I'm saying is that countries that have, and in fact, countries that already have adopted new technologies or are ready for a transition have been able to substitute faster. And especially now up to now, actually, until recently, with low oil prices, it was not so inconsiderate to raise taxes on oil because it somehow was compensating the higher prices for green energy. Now, however, having said that, what I said at the beginning, also timing and sequencing of the policies is important, and readiness, so of access to green technologies. So some of what we heard from Honorable Kiki is that it's not so easy to transition, and some countries are not there yet. But subsidies are a big part of that story. And before even raising carbon taxes, we strongly advise to assess the subsidies to, to carbon emissions. And generally, our view is that if they're levied upstream at the production level rather than by sectors, they're normally less distortionary because they are cutting across. Now, as we heard, depending on the level of development, of the situation of the country, how import dependent they are, so a lot of economic parameters, it may have, any policy measure may have a different impact or amplification. But that's what the evidence finds, that number one is probably assess the subsidies first. Are we heavily subsidizing carbon, heavily intensive carbon sectors? And then second, what is the right policy mix between raising taxes but using the revenues through the expenditure? And yes, it is important to have a system, and now I'm talking about a public sector, so public finance system that is transparent, there is accountability, and that's why I was saying it's also important to assess the credibility of the budget process.
Yeah.
Thank you, Liam.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Right, well, that brings us up, I'm now running 10 minutes late, but so let me wrap it up here. But Steve, let me just give you the final word, if I may. Any final reflections on what you've heard this afternoon? Any thoughts on where you think this debate needs to go next in 2022? Give us your wrap up.
Okay, thank you, Liam. I'm very happy with this conversation. I've made a lot of points when Sarah was speaking, and I'm happy that the World Bank is on top of its game, and they are aware of some of these issues that are confronting developing countries in terms of corruption, transparency, and so on and so forth. I'm also very, very happy that They have done a lot of research that this research can be useful to governments and parliaments around the world. We're going to look at some of those research findings. And I'm also very, very happy that this initiative to discuss topical issues, should be sustained, because it's very, very good. And my colleagues are also listening. They are on Facebook. They are sending me messages that it's a good start. It's a good start. So I'm happy that something has happened and something is happening. We have to keep talking. And we share the same thinking that we should bridge the gap between the poor and the rich, poor nations and developing nations. And I don't know whether you people also agree with me that the response of some countries on the news from South Africa should be commended. The scientists there should be commended and congratulated. We should thank South Africa for informing the world timely and on time, instead of giving the impression that if you say it, then you are wrong. Okay, so on that note, I'm grateful that I've been given the opportunity to participate, and I commend Liam for this initiative. It is a very good one. The world is going to benefit from our continued discussion. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Well, look, that takes us to close on top of the hour. So let's wrap it up there. Thank you so much to everybody for participating in this. That has been an incredibly rich discussion, and I think it reflects some of the political and economic complexities that, as Steve says, we're going to have to continue to talk about next year. But I think at the very heart of the matter is something Steve left us with there, which is that the only way we are going to solve this is by finding ways to bridge the gap between the rich and the poor. And we have some of those mechanisms, we have some of those tools, but I think if we're honest, we've got to go an awful lot further and an awful lot faster. So thanks everyone for joining us. If you're watching, please share this video with your parliamentary colleagues in parliaments around the world. One of our big objectives in 2022 is to increase the size of our parliamentary network, because we think it is important that we work together in conversations like this to learn from each other. We are very blessed to be able to bring to the table, to the conversation, to the dialogue, some of the world's experts in the World Bank and the IMF, but we're also determined to work harder with partners who share our objectives and our mission to make poverty history. So thank you very much indeed for joining us today. Thank you, Steve and Chiara, for a brilliant discussion. We look forward to you sharing some of the papers and documents that you talked about, because we'd like to read. And if you've been watching this and you've been inspired to write down some of your own thoughts, our Parliamentary Network website, which is parlnet.org, is available as a platform for you to share your points of view, your perspective, your views on what we need to do next. So please just get in touch with us. We'd love to hear what you have to say. That's it for now, everyone. Thank you so much indeed for a brilliant discussion. Have a great Christmas if I don't see you before. Thank you.
Thank you. Best wishes to all of you too. Thanks a lot.
Bye for now.